Everything show where we try to make sense of our biggest questions and problems. Today is episode 10, and we will be having on a brilliant guest. Her name is Mari Ovsepan. She's a researcher here at Oxford doing her PhD in cognitive science, religion, and how to make sense of all of those things. Now, I'm super stoked about today. There's a few reasons. One is Mari is going to be joining us here live. So if you watch on YouTube, you can watch us chat in person. I have found in my history podcasting that doing interviews in person is a whole other ball game than doing it at a distance. For some reason, it's immensely more distracting and harder to do a good job. So we'll see. We'll do our best. And also, of course, Mari is extraordinary. I went to a talk that she gave last night. She was speaking at a pub in town, like upstairs, this beautiful old pub in Oxford with these chairs arranged around her. And she talked about the importance of holding doubt and questions and uncertainty while also living with some kind of faith. She is practicing Christian, but she's poetic and insightful, and the kind of person that when you're around them, you all of a sudden realize that you've been too hectic or too out of touch with your being, or too absorbed in your day-to-day life and not at all enough, in touch with the deeper things in life that can make you feel calm and centered and purposeful and meaningful and all those sorts of things. And so it'll be a really, really great honor to bring her on here and have her, sit alongside us. Let's see, today is episode 10. I'm going to check my notes real quick, but I'm pretty sure that this is coming out close to the holidays, Christmas-ish, the week before, I believe. And that's really exciting. Right now, it's way ahead of that. It's the beginning of November for me still. I try to record these ahead of time to give everybody enough, cushion to get their ducks in line. And by everybody, I mean me. I need to get my stuff together. So anyway, I am really excited about that. I've just barely begun doing my thinking about the holidays and what I want to buy people, because of course it's just a really, really fun time to go out and buy a lot of stuff for people. It gives you an excuse, and so I'm really excited about that. I don't know, I'll let you know in a couple months time how that went, I suppose. I hope for you that it has been and continues to be a joyous and warm season. I know a lot of people have really great holidays surrounded by a lot of really supportive and communicative individuals, and then the others of us don't, or have heartbreak for some reason or another. And so I am holding that space for all of us and wishing you all the warmth this season. So anyway, that's that. Our podcast stuff, starting with the next episode, I believe I will be announcing winners for people who have entered the book giveaway by writing a review of the podcast, which is super exciting. I can't wait to start giving books away. I have a list of books that I really love that are on my bookshelf, my personal bookshelf, that I am sort of recommending for reading, and also will be giving one of those away a week. StephanieRupert.com/book giveaway, all one word, or /podcast. And then you can click there from the links on that page. And so you can check out the books, and they're really great. And it's the holidays, and so maybe you want to poke around and get some of those books for people anyway. That's all the stuff. You can listen to this on most podcast platforms. If there's a podcast platform that I haven't heard of that I'm not on yet, please let me know. There's so many these days. It's really hard to keep up with the times. So let me know, of course, whatever I can do for you. And now, of course, most importantly, I will be bringing on Mari. So she's going to be here in person. I'm going to go meet her at the lodge outside and then bring her in, and we will be right back. Okay, so here is Mari. Mari, can you pronounce your name correctly for everybody?
Mari Ovsepan.
That's Russian.
That's Russian. That's actually Armenian, but hey.
I'm so ignorant. I'm so ignorant. Okay, so do you want to tell us then a little bit about your story? Like,
Sure.
I don't know, personal stuff, work stuff, maybe how they go together,
Sure.
whatever.
That's exciting. How much time do I have?
50 minutes.
Oh, exciting. Wonderful. Well, I'm originally from Russia. That's where I grew up. I'm probably not quite identifying strongly with being Russian, since both of my parents are not from Russia. My father's Armenian, my mother's also third culture. And I grew up in a very multicultural, multi-religious context, with so many different worldviews and languages and perspectives, and that really shaped who I am in deep, profound ways, I would say. And in many ways kind of taught me that there is no such thing as a view from nowhere, and you always have to evaluate all of these multiple textured realities before you make any decision. Sometimes can be paralyzing. So in many ways, I guess growing up, I was thinking a lot of, say, the question of religion. My grandmother's Muslim, grandfather atheist, dad agnostic, mom was profoundly confused about all of these realities when I was a child. And I remember actually actively thinking as a 7-8-year-old that I can never choose a religion for myself because that would offend everyone in my family, because it's so varied, and that's kind of, again, what I was growing up with. But today I find that background really helpful, actually, with research, and particularly in the world of academia. So yeah, I always loved questions, always loved exploring things, and always felt very much drawn to mind and culture and religion, which through a very long journey through a variety of areas in research, eventually I'm now in science and religion, building the bridges between cognitive approaches to religion and more cultural understanding of things, and trying to give space to both.
So what is so you come from a very multicultural background, which gave you a way to understand different ways of thinking and feeling in the world.
Yeah. Thinking about thinking.
I know people, I'm sure that my listeners are so tired of me talking about like methodology. Nobody gives a about methodology, but it's important. So that's not unrelated to what you like work on, right?
Yes, in many ways that has been shaping my research, both back in the day when I was doing psycholinguistics, cognitive science, when I was actually trying to understand, there's this whole area within linguistics called linguistic relativity theory, and kind of how language shapes the mind or shapes our reality today. And again, it's kind of, there are all of these oppositional forces, and in any sort of area, of course, there's Chomskyan linguistics, which is much more about structures, and sort of everything is way more scientific, so to say. And then, of course, the moment we bring in culture, things get messy, and it's really interesting. Completely unintentionally, I try to walk away from that, and wasn't even looking in that direction, but somehow my research right now is again shaped around those conversations where I look at theory of mind and within cognitive science and religion approaches, and how actually our way of thinking in the West about theory of mind might not be the most helpful way of thinking about theory of mind. Perhaps there are different theories of mind, so to say.
By theory of mind, do you mean ways of conceptualizing the mind, or do you mean those like specific idea that we have of like humans being able to empathize?
Right. Well, there are different ways, of course, you're absolutely right, different ways of talking about it or conceptualizing this sort of vocabulary. I think both, in a way. So there is, of course, a psychological term of it, which would be kind of a way of mentalizing, acknowledging that the person in front of me has a mind to begin with, a mind that is different from the world.
And that's like kind of unique to humans, right?
Which, well, kind of actually. Yeah, there is a lot of controversial research on that, right. But it seems that to the extent that we possess it, it seems to be at least pretty unique, which is interesting. But again, we have this one way of conceptualizing that in the West, and right now some exciting ethnographic research is coming out that is suggesting that perhaps there are more ways of thinking about it, more ways of thinking about thinking, which in the end results in a very different way of experiencing the world. That I think is controversial, but really interesting.
Okay, so this isn't what I brought you on to talk about today, but it's, but I need to,
we can connect.
I need to learn things. I need to learn things. Yeah. So what
did you bring?
What are the other ways of, what are the other ways of talking about? So, because I've encountered quote unquote theory of mind with a capital T and a capital M in the literature for years and years and years.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's always talked about, like in psychological literature, evolutionary stuff, it's always talked about as this mechanism that evolved mostly probably in humans.
Yes.
In which we can like perceive that other people are thinking and feeling things.
Yes.
What are the other ways? Or like one or two other ways?
Oh, absolutely. That is such a brilliant question. So Tanya Luhrmann is an anthropologist at Stanford University and a cognitive anthropologist. So she's bridging all of these areas of research are to do with mind and with religion and with cognition. She's the one who wrote this fascinating book called When God Talks Back, trying to understand the experience of American evangelicals. And what they did in 2011 at Stanford, they had this very interesting conference where she brought together a bunch of different anthropologists, ethnographers, psychologists, linguists, and essentially asked them this question: well, what is a theory of mind, and how do we, what is it that we actually see if we work in other cultures? And kind of by way of leading that in, probably what you did want to talk about more today is a bit more about a cognition and extended mind and kind of all of that encultured, embedded, embodied stuff, which really links into that in a really powerful way, I think, because I'll bring in Charles Taylor.
Okay, he's a theorist of modernity, everybody.
Brilliant theorist of modernity, but he talks about porous and buffered self, which Tanya Luhrmann picks up on and says it's not the self he talks about the porous mind, and that becomes a very interesting distinction in approaching theory of mind as a multiple variable, so to say, where kind of that whole experience that we have again in the West, where Taylor begins by asking, why is it that in the 1500s it was impossible for us not to believe in all sorts of witches and demons and spirits and ghosts and so on and so forth, and somehow today, you know, we just walk around and experience the world very differently. That is not part of our experience, not part of our reality. And it's not just about belief, it's that question of experience, what changes about the experience. So he talks about that porosity, that there's something about that porous self that allows us to kind of experience the world differently. And Tanya Luhrmann picks up on it, and she says that there's something about that porous, buffered mind distinction. And then she talks about other cultures and how in different cultures people do experience the world differently. And actually, the reason I got very much interested in her research was from my own personal experience of, again, having friends from other cultures. And I remember one time walking just down the road here in Oxford with my friend from Uganda and talking to her about just, I don't remember what we were talking about, but she at some point just said, Marie, have you ever met a witch? I said, well, if I have, I probably don't know about that. And she said, well, you know, I one time I saw a witch turn a man into a tree. And she was studying here in Oxford, doing the same program, so it's not some sort of, you know, kind of loopy statement she was saying. It was, you know, kind of statement of her experience. And as much as I wanted to take it seriously, without even thinking immediately, my response was, what do you mean a tree? Do you mean that his skin,
symbolically?
Exactly. It's like, is it that he sort of develops a sort of disease that looked like bark on his skin, or his arms grew stiff and looked like, you know? So it's just like started asking all these questions, that whether it's a conceptual thing or metaphorical thing, and she just looked at me as if I'm completely.
She was like, really. Maria was a legit tree.
Yeah, she was just like a tree. It was a tree.
Wow.
And I was like, well, what on earth is going on? Because again, I don't feel like I have that right to completely dismiss a statement of a completely sane person, you know, and then just dismiss her experience. But at the same time, my framework does not allow for anything that would explain that, right?
Yeah.
And that's where I got really interested in ethnographic research, and where Luhrmann brings in some of the Melanesian and culture and talks about actually perspectivism as one of the theories of mind, which suggests that there's not a clear boundary between different minds, and actually you can have an experience of experiencing the world as a human or as a say, leopard, and then you have an experience of at least there's an expectation in the culture where you can turn into. And it's I think that framework is interesting because it says something about how we perceive our minds, how we think about thinking might actually have more to do with how we experience the world.
It's really interesting. You know, I have a group of friends, several of whom are from different areas in Africa, and there's a lot of black magic is what it's called, practiced.
Absolutely.
And here at Oxford, and they're legit like spooked, you know, that like it scares the hell out of them. And I find it really interesting because the way that we think about quote unquote magic in the West is like, again, like a singular actor creating some sort of spell or something. Whereas really what you're saying here is that in another framework or in another way of existing, people are
participants.
Yes, much more like interconnected. And so magic in that sense, or, you know, whatever is transpiring between people, it happens in a much more like collective or interpersonal way. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah,
that's fascinating.
They're very daily sort of examples of that. Where again, we're talking about cultures and sort of buffered mind or extended mind. And I think we don't necessarily have to sort of juggle all these fancy terms. You can just talk about extended mind, which actually is a term as well, but I think a much more workable term. And again, I'm coming from a mix of Middle Eastern and European cultures in my own family, and I've definitely witnessed both and the mix of both and thought a lot about that. And then it was also really interesting moving to the States and then coming living here in Oxford for 5 years and just seeing how the Western sensorium is so radically different. In the East, again, you have a more extended mind. Traditionally, the Asian cultures, the Eastern cultures, Middle Eastern cultures, there is much more extended sense of self. And again, Luhrmann and her colleagues, Eve Benzinger as well, they talk about this idea that in Asia, for instance, that there is an assumption that a host would be able to read the mind of the guest, whereas in the West, it is this idea that that kind of buffered self, or I don't even know what to call it, atomistic self, kind of that closed self, that it
like
is your
individual, like a singular.
Singular, yeah. Unless you communicate your desire, unless you communicate, your mind is not known. So there's that subtle distinction, which I have definitely witnessed a lot in my own life where, say in Russia or in Armenia, if somebody offers you something, it is can politely would normally say, oh, no, thanks, I'm all right. But the host would always have to guess whether you actually want it or not, and then offer you again if they think that you do want it. Whereas my first sort of like dinner in the States, where people asked me whether I wanted dessert, and I was like, oh, no, thank you. They were like, okay, just put it away. I was like, I actually wanted that. I learned quickly.
That's interesting. Yeah, so it must be really, really fascinating, and also like personally challenging to have to like navigate, right? So we've spoken a bit before about your experiences living in a world in which people have somewhat more extended cognition, which is to mean like more communal, more interactive. And then living in the States and living here in the UK, where people are very singular, right? We have this very like individualistic idea. So what like, are there particular things that are like nice about each way of being? Are there, there's there like a pro-con list? Do you have a pro-con list?
Right. Wow. Great question. I don't know if I have a list, but definitely for sure. I feel like I've become sufficiently bilingual in a way, because I definitely have witnessed moments when somebody visiting me from my home culture, from my family even, would just sometimes not be able to interpret some of my behavior here or some of my way of being, actually, and it would be almost foreign and almost strange in a way, and I do blame the culture for that in a way. I think again, the way we think about who we are, the self, the way we interact with the world, I do think that both are necessary, because man is an island, and sometimes in the West we do go to the extreme of that individualism and choice really matters, but at the same time we do need to remember that we're all connected. But also there's nothing good can come out of the perspective that makes the individual so insignificant that they lose themselves and lose the sense of self. I think particularly for women it is very important, because again, I kind of grew up with the perspective that most women would identify themselves through always and only through the relational networks they have, that they're wives, mothers, and you can see that on Instagram or whatever, Facebook, if you go and you read the sort of first line, the bio thing, it more often than not
mother, friend,
mother of, friend of, wife of. Whereas it was really interesting to me reading those bios, and I noticed the difference, say in the States, where no one's like CEO, teacher.
People here are like thinker, dreamer, thought leader.
Yes. And
inventor.
I think, again, I'm not saying this is the way to go, that is the way to go. I think for the fullness of human experience, we need both. And the question is, how do we hold both? And I was reading recently Luce Gray, French philosopher, a wonderful feminist, who wrote the book called From East to West, and that's where she also analyzes a lot of that kind of textured conversation and talks about the matter of air, the importance of spaces in between where we kind of create that. I guess theologically I find that also very interesting, because from kind of my Christian perspective, which is also very much informed by Eastern Orthodoxy and Trinitarian sort of Christianity, which is that is very strongly highlighted where I'm coming from. There's that idea of hypostasis, which is the sort of self, that kind of core of the identity. And then there's the ecstasis, which we get the word ecstatic from, which is that outpouring of love. And God is described by both the hypostasis and the ecstasis, the idea that the Father is not the Son, the Son is not the Spirit, and kind of the whole kind of Trinitarian lingo there. But also it's that constant outpouring out of that dance that creates the world, that is the essential definition of love. And I think if we talk about sort of theological anthropology, to me, this is the fullness of human experience, being able to keep that kind of Western self-identity, uniqueness of, I am not you, you're not me. But at the same time, there has to be that ecstatic exchange between us. Otherwise, life is so boring. Nothing happens. Learning is not happening. Love is not happening. Friendship is not happening. Nothing can happen in the world that is the world of hypostasis. We need that ecstatic.
Yeah, we do. I had an interesting conversation yesterday with a friend where I said something. They were talking about the trials of love or whatever, and I said, well, the thing about humans is you're screwed if you do, and you're screwed if you don't. Right? Like you will be hurt if you engage people, because loss is inevitable in some way, in some form or another, and you will be hurt if you don't, because you'll be terribly lonely. And the thing is, like, we may as well love, right? And we need, as social creatures, we need it. And so that like ecstasis, is that the word? It comes with sacrifices in a way, but it's sort of the thing that makes us human.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's what it is. I think that's what also, in a funny way, characterizes so much of our world, the way we're rethinking physics right now, and biology, and so much of the kind of networkism is coming into the conversation on every possible level. Relational ontology. I think something is shifting in the way we think about the world and ourselves, and I find it very exciting.
Yeah, it is really exciting. So in the West, we have a history of sort of progressively individualizing and thinking about ourselves as very solitary, rational creatures. So do you think this phenomena that has occurred, in which we have become somewhat Cartesian, as you mentioned in your talk last night, by which I mean thinking beings, and we have become solitary, we've thought about ourselves as like solitary thinkers, right? Is that sort of an aberration in history? Is this like one of the only times that kind of thing has happened? If we look across cultures and back in time, it's kind of unusual, is it not?
think it is. I think that's such a great question. I'm not a historian, so I probably wouldn't be able to speak into that with any amount of authority. But I've looked recently into imagination and how thinking about imagination has changed so much in history, depending on culture, but also even in the West. You know, the way we thought about imagination in the Middle Ages as something that actually was pointing us towards truth and actually revealing that was an embodied thing, and how that, again, with Descartes, and I'm not trying to demonize Descartes, but a lot of, maybe bastardized ideas of Descartes definitely have shaped our culture today. And so that became just in your head, the sort of almost derogatory term, right? It's just imagination, you know. And so I think the same thing here. It's ideas have consequences, right?
Yeah.
It's not just a word on a page. They shape, they do trickle down at some point from, you know, these thinkers and armchair philosophers. You know, those ideas travel far and wide. And then what is really interesting to me as well is that within one culture, you can sometimes have very clashing ideas and very clashing sensibilities, which I think today, the West today is probably characterized by that. It's not so much just one thing. I guess that whole multiculturalism does have a fruit in the fact that it's hard to kind of do research or even just acknowledge that this is our main way of thinking here today, because I don't think there is one. So interesting multiplicity. So we have to always account for that.
Yeah, we do. I mean, I wouldn't say that what's happening in the West right now feels particularly sophisticated or even that far ranging. You know, I think that there's a lot of people have a lot of different ideas about what's best, but sort of on a still within the Western framework. You know, we're sort of pushing about politics, which is important, and we should continue to be pushing each other around politically, but we're not like moving towards like an extended self.
I don't think we are.
No, in fact, maybe and maybe social media will make it so that, you know, the way that we're relating to it right now, I think kind of entrenches us in this like individualistic, somewhat egotistical model.
I think social media, at least the way it operates today, just locks us in on ourselves even more, and that's the sad thing. That is actually an interesting thing when we think about extended self and all the different ways that all the different things, the matter that shapes who we are. And when we bring in social media, and actually the question is, well, this is one of those primary technologies that are shaping who we are. And again, it's fascinating to me that, you know, there are already people out there in the world who were born with these technologies and who cannot even imagine the world for real without those technologies. What does that mean?
Well, like,
could
you and I imagine what the world were like without writing?
No, not really.
No, and I really don't think we can.
That's
because
right.
Our minds are shaped around the idea
Exactly.
that information can be written down.
Exactly.
It's just it blows my mind, and I keep every once in a while I mention it on the podcast, and people are going to be sick of it, and it's a cornerstone of, you know, the book that I'm working on. But I think we really tend to radically underestimate the extent to which our technologies are technologies, you know,
very much so,
and are integrated into who we are. And I've never really understood the field of transhumanism. And in fact, anytime I've ever heard, we can talk about this over dinner, but anytime I've ever heard the phrase like transhumanism, and I can't tell you how many conferences there are today on like transhumanism, post, you know, and I just sort of like roll my eyes. I'm like, I'm so not interested in that. I don't even know what it means, but I think it.
Why you're not interested?
I don't know why I find it like just like radically off-putting and uninteresting. I'm just like, I shake my head and walk away. But transhumanism does have something to do with how the human is evolving into the future. Yeah.
Well, yes, in a way. I mean, there are different ways to think about transhumanism. I think a very broad way about it. I think the way Mari Minsky said, to be human is to be transhuman. We always transcend who we are, and it's just what you said about writing. Like, in a way, that's just another technology. It's the moment we picked up the stick, we became transhuman. I think that's my very broad and generous way of thinking about it, because we have extended ourselves already, and that first technology started shaping matter. Lively matter is shaping us as much as we're shaping it, and I think I think it's really interesting, even with writing, what you just said. How different that is from narrative cultures, and again, the cognition that is based around the narrative and the arc of the narrative. Whereas I find very often that the way I think naturally is the way I do in my research. I have to have a mind map, because I don't think linearly, and then I literally have to figure out how to translate my mind map, which ideally is not even mind map, the 3D mind map, the way those connections have to happen in my head. Then to translate that into the linear word on paper, the strings of words and strings of sentences, that is one of the most stressful things for me, actually, in research. And I find that, but in a way that is what the culture is today, right? And that is part of what is shaping research, and part of what is shaping the conversation, the discourse. And I don't know, I think that's interesting, the way that stuff works.
Is this why you learned German? Have you?
No, that was part of my degree.
This is
choice.
Okay. This is a joke. This is a philosophy joke.
Yeah,
Nobody else would know. Probably not know. Most German writing is the most linear argument you will ever encounter your entire life, and it's enormously frustrating. And I can't. I want like a nice, neat introduction and topic sentences. Making the argument, and then a conclusion. Anyway, this is not important for what we're talking about at all. But if anybody tells you that they've read a book by Kant or Hegel or Schelling or Fichte or anybody, just be really impressed, or ask them questions, because chances are pretty good they understood nothing. Okay, do you have anything you want to say before I? Oh, yes, there is something I want to talk about. So we've been talking a little bit about this idea of the extended self, extended cognition, like being in relation with people. I won't preface it. I'll let you preface it. How does this relate to your affinity for and the concept of horizontal transcendence?
Oh, wow. Extended self and horizontal transcendence. Well, there is a lot of interesting post-secular research right now, post-secular thinkers challenging the theological concept of transcendence, which is a kind of binary between the world of immanence, which is here and now, and the world of transcendence that is out there and not necessarily connected to here and now. And I think that the perspectives that challenge this are all the perspectives that are to do with our body, that are saying there is no transcendence that is not embodied transcendence, because we are embodied creatures, and for us to experience transcendence is to experience our bodies and transcending our bodies, and that's where horizontal transcendence comes into the conversation, and probably links in some way. I haven't thought that through yet, but links, I think, to extended cognition, which is also very much about the idea that we're not just brains in a vat, or just disembodied minds floating around the world, that we are ingrained to begin with, that we are embodied, that we're embedded in the culture, that, again, human is not just the solitary unit, that to be human is to be extended into the relationship and connection with another human. So that's where I think horizontal transcendence begins, that I and thou, where Martin Buber kind of talks about two ways of being, the I and it, objectification ultimately, and I and thou, the relationship. And I think that I and thou, and Lucy Gray, who's a post-secular thinker, she also talks very much about that I and thou, that space between us, the air between us, that is essentially can be connected in beautiful ways into theology and the Holy Spirit, and that space that is the space of connection, the productive space. And I think that that's the beginning of it. And it doesn't just happen between humans. It can happen, again, Martin Buber talking about, I contemplate a tree. He has this beautiful, beautiful passage in his book that I love so much. And you can look at the tree and you can, objectify it in some way and kind of come to it already knowing what you think the tree is. Or you can sort of try to summarize all the different perspectives from biology, from every possible science you can apply to a tree. And would that actually, tell you anything about a tree? Probably will, something. But to really know what the tree is, you need to encounter the tree, to treat you as thou, in a way. And in that meeting, in that space in between, which is some level of horizontal transcendence, something happens. I think they're fascinating perspectives are met from neuroscience right now. There is so much about the small self and the experience of transcendence, where we actually, the moment we kind of come into that space of awe, the perspective on self becomes smaller. I think that extended self, it's again finding vocabulary to translate, the neuroscience into theology, into philosophy, into all these different things. But I find it interesting that thinkers all over these different disciplines are actually thinking about that and asking those questions. So,
yeah, thank you. That's helpful and interesting. I have been thinking about horizontal transcendence and extended cognition. I've been planning on having Mari on for a while, and so I've been thinking about extended cognition because this is a conversation we've been having. And so transcendence is typically, it's like historically what we think of in the States, in the West, as what you do when you like spiritually reach for God, right? Because Plato, way back in the day, thousands of years ago, said, hey, the way that we connect with God upwards, right? And we escape from this world. And that is it has always been like a very solitary idea.
Yeah.
Like these are the roots of the West in the way that we are today go really, really deep. Back to Plato and probably further, early Bible stuff. But that is sort of, I think, challenged by this idea of immanence, right? There's transcendence and immanence, and we pose these against each other. And immanence is sort of being in the world. It's not a vertical, but a horizontal thing. And so I've been thinking about extended cognition as sort of this more immanent, right? This more we're together here right now, and finding ways to experience the kind of overcoming of selfhood. I think that's an interesting way to put transcendence, people trying to overcoming of selfhood with this world that we're on here. Like within, like across and with people, as opposed to reaching for some like abstract, heaven, abstract heaven.
Yeah,
maybe no. And this is sort of, this is slightly more common, or at least some of the ideas of experiencing love as religious and what have you, like interaction in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. Yeah.
Oh yes. Wow, there are so many different things that come to mind. Well, to begin with, again, back to neuroscience, there is this fascinating book called Neuroscience of Religious Experience by Patrick McNamara from Boston University, your alma mater, and he talks about this mechanism of decentering of self there, which he describes as something that actually happens in a variety of contexts, including, experience of awe and wonder out in nature, or actually sex is one of those experiences, or experience of God, kind of, again, that transcendence we talk about. And he's not going deep into philosophy of, what kind of transcendence it is, but I think maybe, Ann Taves talks about this kind of building block approach to religion, and perhaps there are also building block approaches we can, invent towards transcendences, because theologically, when we talk about God, I think at least Christians oftentimes, again, can be very Platonic about it, which is not necessarily the orthodoxy, or at least the orthodoxy of incarnation. If we bring in I was talking about Beheimatung, this kind of Heimat idea of home in German, and the idea of God literally behoming the world. Ideas of deep incarnation, fascinating ideas that, when God has incarnated himself in Christ, it's not just, humans, it's matter, right? It's every bit of dust, it's the stars, it's the trees, it's the animal world. It's incredibly beautiful. And so, of course, then, if that is the kind of God we talk about and the kind of transcendence we really talk about, then we should be able to encounter that in the immanence, in the encounter with the world, which I find that a lot of people encounter this way. For me, it was definitely my journey as well. Growing up, again, as I said, there were so many different perspectives, and I was committed to not committing to anything. But as much as it was also an intellectual journey of exploring perspectives, it was also very real experience, which happened through the world, not escaping the world, but through the beauty, through nature, through encountering God and those things as well.
Sorry, that sounds private, so I'll ask her about that later, and we can leave it at that. I think we've been talking for about 45 minutes. I haven't been watching the clock. I normally take really rigorous notes. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, we discussed it. Marie's, again, one of those people, a brilliant type of person who's constantly dropping quotes and names into conversations. She's like, Leonard Cohen once said, and who did you? All these people. I wrote it down. So anyway, I will provide links to books and the people mentioned in this. In the show notes, which you can find at stephanierupert.com/10. This is episode 10.
Yay.
So stephanierupert.com/10 will be those notes. And do you have anything that you want people to follow, or
just explore those things?
Yeah, explore those things, and email me and I'll ask her questions for you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.